Millionaire receives mysterious gift from his black maid. Is meaning leaves him paralyzed. A simple gift carries a profound message that shakes him to his core. As he uncovers its significance, he confronts truths that he had long ignored. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The rain drummed against the tall windows of Mark Johnson's mansion, creating a stark contrast with the bright lights and animated chatter inside. The annual Technology Sector Gala was in full swing, with Silicon Valley's elite mingling in tailored suits and designer dresses. Mark stood near the grand staircase, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, watching his guests network and laugh at carefully crafted jokes. Despite being surrounded by the most influential figures in tech, Mark couldn't shake off a persistent feeling of disconnection. He nodded mechanically at passing colleagues who praised his latest acquisition, a promising AI startup that would likely double his already substantial net worth. The conversations felt hollow, the laughter artificial, and the constant back-patting increasingly meaningless. The mansion's great hall sparkled with crystal chandeliers and modern art pieces worth millions. Yet Mark found himself focusing on imperfections. A slightly crooked painting, a small scratch on the marble floor, anything to distract from the emptiness growing inside him. Board members from his company clustered nearby, discussing profit margins and market projections, but their words seemed to blur together into meaningless noise. James Chun, his CFO, approached with two potential investors. "Mark, you must meet the Peterson brothers. They're revolutionizing quantum computing on the East Coast." Mark shook hands and exchanged pleasantries, but his mind wandered to the stack of unopened reports on his desk upstairs. The brothers spoke enthusiastically about their latest projects, but Mark could barely maintain eye contact. As the evening wore on, Mark excused himself from a discussion about cryptocurrency trends and retreated to a quieter corner of the room. From this vantage point, he observed the social dynamics playing out before him, the careful positioning, the strategic conversations, the subtle power plays. He'd been part of this world for so long, yet tonight it felt like watching actors in a play he no longer wanted to participate in. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Jasmine, his housekeeper of 15 years, moved quietly through the crowd with practiced efficiency. She carried herself with dignity despite the occasional dismissive glances from guests. Making her way to Mark, she held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Mr. Johnson, this arrived for you earlier today. I thought you might want to see it now." Her voice was soft but clear, her expression giving nothing away. Mark accepted the package, noting its lightweight and aged appearance. "Thank you, Jasmine. Is everything all right in the kitchen?" "Yes, sir. The catering staff has everything under control." She turned to leave but paused briefly. "The package, it's important." Without further explanation, she disappeared into the crowd, heading back toward the kitchen. Intrigued by her unusual behavior, Mark carefully unwrapped the package. Inside, he found an old brass bracelet, its surface worn smooth in places, with intricate patterns barely visible under years of tarnish. As he held it, a strange sensation washed over him, a feeling of connection to something larger than himself, though he couldn't explain why. The bracelet seemed out of place among the expensive watches and jewelry adorning his guests. Yet he couldn't take his eyes off it. The pattern suggested a history, a story he couldn't decipher but felt drawn to understand. Later, as the party began winding down, Mark found Jasmine organizing the cleanup in the kitchen. "The bracelet," he began. "Where did it come from?" Jasmine paused her work, her expression carefully neutral. "It's a legacy, Mr. Johnson. A piece of history that belongs to this house and the families connected to it." Before he could press further, she turned her attention back to directing the cleanup crew. Mark returned to the great hall, the bracelet now in his pocket feeling heavier than its physical weight would suggest. The remaining guests continued their conversations, but he barely registered their presence. His mind was fixed on the mysterious object and Jasmine's cryptic response, sensing that both held secrets that would force him to confront truths he'd never considered before. The morning after the gala, Mark sat in his home office, the bracelet placed carefully on his mahogany desk. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the dust particles floating in the air. Instead of reviewing quarterly reports or checking market trends, he found himself opening drawers and folders he hadn't touched in years. His office, typically a symbol of modern efficiency with its sleek computers and minimalist design, now looked like an amateur historian's workspace. Old documents, yellowed with age, covered every available surface. Family records, property deeds, and correspondence dating back generations lay scattered around him. Mark started with the most recent documents, working backward through decades of family history. The Johnson family's rise to prominence was well documented. His father's successful ventures in early computing, his grandfather's real estate investments. But as he dug deeper, the paper trail revealed uncomfortable truths about the source of their initial wealth. A property deed from 1852 caught his attention. It detailed the transfer of the land where his mansion now stood, along with an inventory of assets that made his stomach turn. Among the listed items were human beings, their names and ages cataloged like furniture. His fingers trembled as he read through the list, stopping at one name, Eliza, age 19. Next to her name was a detailed description that included mention of a brass bracelet, described as a family heirloom she refused to part with. The same bracelet that now sat on his desk, its tarnished surface reflecting the morning sun. Mark pushed back from his desk, running his hands through his hair. The tech mogul who regularly made billion-dollar decisions without breaking a sweat now felt overwhelmed by the weight of this discovery. His family's wealth, the very foundation of his current success, was built on human suffering. He pulled up his computer and began cross-referencing names and dates from the documents. Local historical records confirmed what the papers suggested. His family had been one of the largest slave-owning families in the region. The mansion he'd always seen as a symbol of success now felt like a monument to cruelty. Hours passed as he dove deeper into the research. He found letters written by his great-great-grandfather describing the plantation's operations with cold efficiency. Financial ledgers detailed the purchase and sale of human beings as if they were livestock. Each document added another layer to a history he'd never been taught. The bracelet's significance began to take shape. According to several accounts, Eliza had brought it with her when she was forcibly transported from her home. Despite attempts to take it from her, she had managed to keep it hidden. The bracelet was mentioned repeatedly in plantation records as a source of controversy. The overseers viewed it as a symbol of defiance. Mark's hands shook as he picked up the bracelet again. The patterns he'd noticed earlier now seemed to tell a story of their own. What had appeared to be random decorative elements revealed themselves as West African symbols. Their meanings lost to time, but their significance unmistakable. His phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications, emails from Boer. D members, meeting reminders, stock alerts. For the first time in his career, he ignored them all. The contrast between his modern concerns and the historical documents before him seemed almost obscene. As evening approached, Mark found himself unable to leave his office. The weight of privilege and responsibility pressed down on him with each new discovery. His own success, which he'd always attributed to hard work and innovation, now seemed inextricably linked to historical injustices he'd never acknowledged. The final document he read that day was a letter written by Eliza herself, preserved in the County Historical Society's records. In it, she described her hopes for future generations and her belief that someday justice would prevail. The letter ended with a promise that her descendants would never forget their history or lose their dignity, no matter what was taken from them. Mark looked around his office, at the expensive art on the walls, the latest technology on his desk, all the trappings of wealth and success, and felt a profound sense of shame. The bracelet on his desk was no longer just an interesting antique. It was physical proof of his family's role in a dark history he could no longer ignore. That evening, Mark sat in the living room with Sarah, his partner of 5 years. The bracelet lay between them on the coffee table, its presence changing the atmosphere of their usually comfortable evening routine. Sarah, a corporate attorney known for her pragmatic approach to problems, watched Mark with growing concern as he explained his discoveries. I can't just go back to business as usual, Mark said, his voice tight with emotion. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about our success, it's built on something terrible. He stood up and paced the room, his usual confidence replaced by restless energy. Sarah adjusted her position on the leather sofa, her legal training evident in her measured response. Mark, you're not responsible for what your ancestors did. You've built your own success through innovation and hard work. Have I? Mark stopped pacing and turned to face her. The initial capital that funded my first startup came from family money. The connections that got me my first investors were through my father's network. Even this house dash, he gestured around them, everything traces back to that original wealth. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. Then use your position to make a difference. You have influence, resources. You could start foundations, fund educational programs, create opportunities. It's not that simple, Mark replied, resuming his pacing. The board would fight any significant diversion of company resources. The shareholders would revolt. And our friends. He trailed off, thinking about the guests of the previous night's gala. Since when do you care what the board thinks about your personal decisions? Sarah challenged him. You've never hesitated to push back against them before. Mark sank into an armchair, feeling the weight of multiple worlds colliding. This is different. It's not just about business decisions anymore. It's about questioning everything, our lifestyle, our social circle, the whole system we're part of. The conversation was interrupted by a notification on Mark's phone, another urgent message from the board about the upcoming merger. He silenced it without reading it, something he would have considered unthinkable just days ago. Sarah watched him carefully. You're going to have to find a balance, Mark. You can't completely abandon your responsibilities overnight. My responsibilities. Mark picked up the bracelet, turning it over in his hands. What about my responsibility to address this? To acknowledge the truth? Rising from the sofa, Sarah crossed the room and placed a hand on his shoulder. Then do it thoughtfully. Use your strategic thinking. Make changes that will last, not just dramatic gestures that will backfire. Their conversation was cut short when Mark noticed something unusual about the book he'd been absently handling on the side table, an old volume from the mansion's library. As he opened it, a bundle of aged papers fell out, their edges crumbling with time. His hands trembled as he realized what he was holding, Eliza's diary, hidden away for over a century. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. Sarah sat beside him as he began to read. Eliza's words were powerful and clear, describing daily life on the plantation with unflinching honesty. She wrote about the pain of separated families, the constant fear, but also about small acts of resistance and moments of human connection. Her strength radiated through her words, along with her determination to maintain her dignity and identity. One passage particularly struck Mark. They may own my labor, but they cannot own my soul. This bracelet carries the stories of my people, and as long as it exists, so will our truth. Sarah watched as Mark read, noting the profound effect the words had on him. This is more than just history, isn't it? She asked quietly. Mark nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it was different, more resolved, but also more uncertain. I have to do something. I just don't know what yet. Whatever you decide, Sarah said, remember that change doesn't happen overnight, and you'll face resistance. Not everyone will understand or support what you're trying to do. Mark closed the diary carefully, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. The merger documents waiting for his review, the board meeting scheduled for tomorrow, the charity gala next week. All of it seemed trivial compared to what he'd discovered. Yet these were the tools and platforms he had at his disposal. Over the next few days, Mark immersed himself in Eliza's diary, reading between meetings and late into the night. The pages revealed a complex network of relationships and resistance within the enslaved community. Eliza wrote about secret meetings, coded messages, and an underground support system that helped several people escape to freedom. Her descriptions were precise and powerful. She documented how the enslaved community maintained their cultural practices in secret, teaching children their history through stories and songs. The bracelet, she wrote, was more than jewelry. It was a map of sorts, its patterns containing information about safe houses and escape routes. During a particularly long reading session, one entry caught Mark's attention. "We dream of a day when our children's children will walk these grounds as free people, but freedom without knowledge is just another kind of chains. We teach in whispers, but we never stop teaching." This passage prompted Mark to research current educational conditions in the surrounding areas. The statistics he found were troubling. The neighborhoods around his mansion, once part of the plantation, now house some of the city's most underfunded schools. Without telling anyone except his assistant, Mark arranged to visit Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary, a public school in the heart of the historically black neighborhood adjacent to his property. The school building, a stark contrast to his mansion, showed clear signs of neglect. Water stains on the ceiling, outdated textbooks, and computers that belonged in a museum. Principal Washington, a stern woman with kind eyes, gave him a tour. The classrooms were overcrowded, with teachers trying their best to engage students despite limited resources. In one room, children shared textbooks because there weren't enough to go around. In another, a science teacher apologized for not being able to do experiments because the lab equipment was broken. "We make do with what we have," Principal Washington explained, her voice matter of fact. "Our teachers pay for supplies out of their own pockets. Most of our students come from families struggling to make ends meet, but these kids have so much potential." Mark watched as a young girl solved a complex math problem on a cracked whiteboard. Her excitement at finding the solution reminded him of his own passion for problem-solving as a child, except he'd had every resource available to nurture that passion. In the computer lab, he saw students taking turns on outdated machines, their enthusiasm undimmed by the technological limitations. A boy explained to him how he was teaching himself to code using free online resources, but could only practice during school hours because he didn't have a computer at home. The cafeteria served as a stark reminder of inequality, while his kitchen at home stocked organic products and specialty items. Here students received basic meals that met minimum nutritional requirements. Principal Washington mentioned that for many students, these were their only reliable meals of the day. During recess, Mark observed the playground, a barren space with broken equipment and cracked asphalt. He remembered Eliza's words about teaching in whispers, and here, generations later, these children were still fighting for access to quality education. The visit left Mark feeling physically ill. He sat in his car afterward, the bracelet heavy in his pocket, thinking about the stark contrast between his wealth and the daily struggles of these students. The technology in his phone alone could probably fund several classroom improvements. His driver waited patiently as Mark processed what he'd seen. Through the car window, he watched students leaving school, many walking home through streets that hadn't seen infrastructure improvements in decades. Some wore worn-out shoes, others carried siblings, all of them navigating a system that seemed designed to hold them back. The guilt he felt wasn't just about historical wrongs anymore. It was about his own complicity in maintaining these disparities. His company had an office just miles away, yet their community outreach had never extended to this neighborhood. Their internship programs recruited from top universities, overlooking the talent struggling to emerge from underfunded schools like this one. Back at the mansion, Mark found Jasmine organizing the library. Instead of their usual brief, professional interactions, he asked if she would join him for a conversation. Her surprise was evident, but she agreed, settling into a chair while maintaining a cautious distance. "How long have you known about the bracelet's history?" Mark asked directly, placing it on the table between them. Jasmine's expression shifted, years of carefully maintained professional distance giving way to something more complex. "My grandmother told me stories about it when I was young. She worked in this house too, and her mother before her. The bracelet has been part of our family's story for generations." Mark leaned forward, noticing for the first time the subtle signs of aging in Jasmine's face, the dignity in her posture that he'd somehow overlooked for 15 years. "Why did you choose now to give it to me?" "Because you're ready to see it," she replied simply. "I've watched you change over the years, Mr. Johnson. When you first hired me, you barely noticed the people who maintained your life. But lately, you've started to see us as people, not just employees." The truth of her words hit Mark hard. He remembered countless moments when he'd walked past her, past all the staff, too absorbed in his own world to acknowledge their humanity. Jasmine continued, her voice gaining strength. My family has worked in this house for 4 generations. We've cleaned these rooms, served at your parties, watched your family's wealth grow while our community struggled. But we've also preserved our history, passed down our stories. She reached for the bracelet, handling it with reverence. This wasn't just jewelry. It was a symbol of resistance. The women in my family kept track of it through the years, waiting for the right moment to bring it back into the light. Mark listened as Jasmine shared her family's story. Her great-grandmother had been a child when emancipation came, but freedom hadn't meant equality. The family had stayed in the area, working as domestic help for the Johnsons, partly to keep watch over their history and partly because limited opportunities left them few choices. We've sent our children to the same underfunded schools for generations, Jasmine explained. My daughter is the first to go to college, working 2 jobs to afford it. The same patterns keep repeating, just in different forms. As she spoke, Mark realized how little he knew about her life outside the mansion. Your daughter? What is she studying? Computer science, Jasmine said, pride evident in her voice. She wants to work in tech, but internships are hard to come by when you don't have connections. She's brilliant, but doors don't open as easily for people like us. The irony wasn't lost on Mark. His company was constantly searching for diverse talent, yet he'd never thought to look within his own household. The community you visited today, Jasmine continued, having heard about his school visit. That's where I live. Those struggling students are our children. We watch your galas from the kitchen, serving drinks to people who could change our community's future with what they spend on a single evening's entertainment. Her words weren't bitter, just matter of fact. She spoke with the clarity of someone who had spent years observing from the margins, understanding both worlds but belonging to neither. Why did you stay? Mark asked. All these years working in this house, knowing its history, Jasmine's response was measured. Because someone needed to witness. Someone needed to remember. And maybe someone needed to be here when the time was right for change. The conversation shifted something fundamental in their relationship. Mark saw Jasmine not just as his housekeeper, but as a keeper of history, a bridge between past and present. Her presence in his house wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about maintaining memory. As their conversation drew to a close, Jasmine stood to return to her duties, but paused. Mr. Johnson, that bracelet found its way back to this house for a reason. The question is, what will you do with the truth it carries? In the weeks following his conversation with Jasmine, Mark began formulating a plan. He established the Johnson Legacy Education Initiative, committing $50 million of his personal wealth as initial funding. The project focused on providing resources, technology, and opportunities to underserved schools in the community, starting with Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary. His executive assistant watched in confusion as he canceled 3 major business meetings to focus on drafting the initiative's framework. The plan included immediate infrastructure improvements, technology upgrades, teacher support programs, and college scholarships. But the announcement received a mixed reception from his social and business circles. During a board meeting at his company, Mark presented his intention to create a paid internship program specifically targeting students from underserved communities. The response was immediate and hostile. This isn't a charity, Mark, Richard Blackwood, a senior board member, interrupted. Our shareholders expect us to hire the best talent available. We can't lower our standards for the sake of social justice. Mark felt his jaw tighten. We're not lowering standards. We're removing barriers. There's a difference. Another board member, Sandra Chun, joined in. Your personal philanthropy is your business, Mark, but this could affect our recruitment reputation. Harvard and Stanford expect preferential access to our internship programs. And they'll continue to have access, Mark responded, standing his ground. But they won't have a monopoly. We're expanding the pool, not replacing it. The tension in the boardroom was palpable. These were people he'd worked with for years, friends he'd celebrated with. But now he saw them differently. Their resistance wasn't just about business. It was about maintaining a system that had benefited them all. Later that week, at a private dinner club, Mark encountered similar pushback from his social circle. James Peterson, a venture capitalist he'd known for decades, pulled him aside. "Look, Mark, we all support giving back," James said, swirling his expensive bourbon. "But you're going about this all wrong. These grand gestures, this public self-flagellation, it's making everyone uncomfortable." "Maybe everyone should be uncomfortable," Mark replied, thinking of Jasmine's daughter working 2 jobs to afford college. "You're not thinking clearly," James continued. "This crusade of yours, it's affecting your reputation. People are starting to question your judgment." The conversation was interrupted by a notification on Mark's phone. Another school had joined the initiative, this one in an area where his family's plantation once extended. The contrast between his old world and new mission couldn't have been clearer. At his company's quarterly strategy meeting, the tension reached a breaking point. Mark presented plans to allocate 10% of the company's research and development budget to projects addressing educational inequality through technology. "This is a publicly traded company," Harold Matthews, the CFO, objected. "We have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders. These social projects might make you feel better about your family history, Mark, but they're not our responsibility." Mark stood at the head of the conference table, the bracelet in his pocket serving as a tangible reminder of why this mattered. "Our duty is to create value, yes, but we get to define what value means. We've built our success on innovation. Now we're going to innovate in social impact." The meeting devolved into heated arguments about corporate responsibility, shareholder value, and the role of business in social change. Mark noticed several board members exchanging concerned glances, probably already plotting ways to limit his authority. That evening, reviewing the day's events in his office, Mark received an email from a prominent business magazine requesting an interview about his controversial new direction. The word controversial made him pause. When had addressing historical wrongs and creating opportunities become controversial? His phone buzzed with messages from concerned friends and business associates, all variations on the same theme. He was risking too much, moving too fast, making people uncomfortable. But for the first time in his career, making people uncomfortable felt like exactly what he needed to do. The annual Tech Industry Humanitarian Awards dinner couldn't have come at a more challenging time. Mark sat in his car outside the venue, a 5-star hotel in downtown San Francisco, struggling with the decision to attend. The bracelet, now a constant companion, felt particularly heavy in his jacket pocket. Inside, the ballroom sparkled with the same luxury he'd once taken for granted. Tech billionaires and venture capitalists mingled with politicians and celebrities, all celebrating their charitable contributions while spending more on dinner than many families earned in a month. "Mark, we weren't sure you'd make it," called out Rebecca Sterling, CEO of a major social media platform. Her greeting was warm, but her eyes were calculating. "We've all been following your recent activities with interest." He'd been nominated for an award for his educational initiative, but the recognition felt hollow. These were the same people who had been calling his board members, expressing concerns about his new direction. Thomas Wright, his oldest friend in the industry and now CEO of a competing company, cornered him by the bar. "What are you trying to prove, Mark? Okay, this crusade of yours, it's making everyone nervous. The old money families are particularly upset. You're not just rattling your own skeleton closet, you're rattling theirs too." "Maybe they need rattling," Mark replied, declining the offered drink. "Have you visited any of the schools in the communities where we built our companies? Have you seen what generational poverty actually looks like?" Thomas's expression hardened. "We all give to charity, Mark. We all have foundations. But you're taking it too far. This personal involvement, these radical changes, you're disturbing the balance." "The balance has been disturbed for centuries," Mark countered. "We've just been too comfortable to notice." The conversation was interrupted by the awards ceremony. Mark sat through speeches about innovation and philanthropy, watching executives congratulate themselves for donating fractions of their wealth while maintaining the systems that created inequality in the first place. When they announced his award, the applause was polite but reserved. As he approached the podium, he could feel the tension in the room. These people had been his peers, his friends, his mentors, but now they felt like strangers. "Thank you," he began, holding the Crystal Award. "But I can't accept this. Not as an achievement. Not when the schools I'm helping should never have been underfunded in the first place. Not when the opportunities we're creating should have existed generations ago. The silence in the room was deafening. He continued, "We're celebrating our generosity tonight, but we're not addressing why our generosity is needed. We're praising ourselves for giving back, without acknowledging what was taken." Several people stood and left the room. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mark could see Thomas shaking his head, Rebecca typing furiously on her phone. The tech industry talks about disruption, about changing the world. But we're only disrupting things that don't threaten our position at the top. We're changing everything except the systems that benefit us. After the speech, Mark found himself isolated at his table. The usual crowd of networkers and well-wishers kept their distance. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from his PR team, trying to manage the fallout. Later, in the hotel bar, an elderly venture capitalist who'd funded his first startup approached. "You're committing social suicide, son. And for what? You can't change the past." "No," Mark agreed, "but we can stop pretending it doesn't affect the present." The drive home was quiet. His driver, a man who'd worked for him for 5 years and whose name he'd only recently bothered to learn properly, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Rough night, Mr. Johnson." Mark looked out at the city lights, thinking about how many worlds existed in this single city, how many lives ran parallel to his without ever intersecting. "Actually, James," he replied, using the driver's name, "I think it was exactly what needed to happen." A month after the awards dinner fiasco, Mark transformed his mansion's grand ballroom, the same space where this journey began, into a venue for a different kind of gathering. Instead of tech elites, he filled it with community leaders, educators, and students. Jasmine wasn't serving at this event. She was scheduled as the keynote speaker. The preparation hadn't been easy. Several regular donors had pulled out upon learning about the event's focus on addressing historical inequities and reparative justice. Major tech news outlets had run stories questioning Mark's mental state and business acumen. His company's stock had taken a hit, but the ballroom was full. Students from Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary sat in the front rows, their presence transforming the space that had previously hosted only the wealthy and privileged. Principal Washington had helped coordinate their attendance, ensuring that the event would have real community representation. Ion, not just token participation. Jasmine took the stage, her usual uniform replaced by an elegant blue dress. The bracelet, the catalyst for all of this change, gleamed on her wrist, temporarily returned to her for this occasion. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the microphone, but her voice was strong and clear. "My great-grandmother was enslaved in this house," she began. The room fell silent. "She cleaned these floors, cooked in that kitchen, and lived in quarters that no longer exist. She wasn't allowed to learn to read, but she taught herself anyway. She passed that determination down through generations." Mark watched from the side of the stage as Jasmine shared her family's story, their struggles, their resilience, their quiet resistance. She spoke about working in the same house where her ancestors had been enslaved, about watching wealth accumulate around her while her own community struggled, about her daughter's dreams of entering the tech industry. This bracelet, she held up her wrist, isn't just jewelry. It's a testament to survival. It's proof that you can erase a people's history, no matter how hard you try. And now, finally, it's becoming a symbol of change. The audience was captivated, but Mark noticed movement at the back of the room. Several prominent local business figures were huddled together, whispering and typing on their phones. He recognized the signs of damage control in progress. After Jasmine's speech, during the fundraising portion of the evening, Mark overheard snippets of conversations that made his stomach turn. Clear PR stunt. Gone off the deep end. Trying to appease the woke mob. Family's reputation ruined. These whispered critiques came from people who'd RSVP'd, not to support the cause, but to witness what they saw as a powerful man's public unraveling. Some had already drafted social media posts questioning the authenticity of his transformation, suggesting it was all a calculated move to appear progressive. Mark watched as these critics networked among themselves, probably already planning how to distance their businesses from his initiatives. A few were board members from his company, likely strategizing how to limit his influence or remove him entirely. But then he looked at the students in the front rows, their faces bright with possibility as they talked with tech industry mentors who genuinely wanted to help. He saw Principal Washington deep in conversation with a foundation director about immediate funding for school repairs. He watched Jasmine's daughter, home from college for the event, explaining her coding projects to impressed Silicon Valley engineers. The real work was happening despite the critics, not for them. The cynics at the back of the room didn't matter as much as the connections being forged, the opportunities being created, the barriers being broken. After the official program ended, a young student approached Mark. "Mr. Johnson," she said, clutching a notebook, "I want to start a tech company someday. Not just any company, one that helps people like us. Will you help me?" Behind her, Mark could see more critics gathering, probably documenting what they saw as his downfall. But the girl's question, her determination, her hope, these were what mattered now. The aftermath of the community event brought intense pressure from all directions. Mark sat in his home office, reviewing the latest messages from Sarah. Their relationship had become strained as his transformation affected their shared social world. Her law firm's partners were expressing concerns about their association with him. "We need to talk," Sarah's latest message read. "This isn't just about you anymore. Your crusade is affecting my career too. The Kingston account is threatening to pull their business because of your latest speech about generational wealth." Mark stared at his phone, feeling the weight of personal consequences he hadn't fully anticipated. Sarah had always been his anchor in the corporate world, understanding both its rules and its rewards. Now that stability was crumbling. The pressure wasn't just personal. His company's stock had dropped 15% in the past month. Major investors were calling for an emergency board meeting. Industry friends had stopped returning his calls. Even his favorite restaurants suddenly couldn't find reservations for him. A small but telling sign of his changing status. In a moment of weakness, he found himself looking at photos from last year's tech conference. Images of himself surrounded by admiring colleagues, celebrated as a visionary leader. The path back to that life seemed deceptively simple. Issue a carefully worded statement about taking time to reflect, make a generous but conventional charitable donation, and slowly retreat from his more radical positions. His PR team had already drafted such a statement, waiting for his approval. "While I remain committed to educational opportunity and corporate responsibility, I recognize that recent statements and actions may have been overly emotional. I will be taking time to reflect and refocus on creating value for our shareholders while continuing to support worthy causes through traditional channels." The statement sat in his email drafts, offering an easy escape route. He could almost feel the relief it would bring. The congratulatory messages from board members, the appreciative notes from fellow CEOs, Sarah's approval. The comfortable embrace of the world he'd always known. Sitting at his desk, he pulled out the bracelet. Its worn surface caught the afternoon light, each scratch and dent representing a piece of history that couldn't be smoothed over with careful PR statements. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah. "The foundation board is willing to quietly distance themselves from your recent initiatives. We can frame it as a strategic restructuring. Just say the word." The temptation to return to his former life grew stronger. He thought about his favorite social club, where his membership was now under review. About the venture capital firms that had started declining his investment offers. About the speaking invitations that had dried up. Opening his laptop, he began typing a response to Sarah, his fingers moving towards acceptance of the compromise she offered. But as he wrote, his eyes fell on a thank you letter from one of the students at Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary. The girl's words were simple but powerful. "Thank you for seeing us." He closed the laptop without sending the response. Walking to his window, he looked out at the grounds of his estate. Somewhere out there, Eliza had walked these same paths, carrying the bracelet and its hidden meanings, refusing to surrender her truth despite the cost. His phone rang. Sarah again. This time he answered. "We need to make a decision, Mark," she said without preamble. "The board is meeting tomorrow. They're prepared to remove you if necessary. We can stop this if you'll just..." "Just what?" he interrupted. "Just pretend none of this matters? Go back to writing checks instead of making changes?" "Be reasonable," Sarah pleaded. "You've made your point. You've done more than most would. No one expects you to sacrifice everything. The word sacrifice hung in the air. What was he really sacrificing? Money he didn't need? Status in a system he no longer respected? Relationships that couldn't withstand moral challenge? I can't go back, he said finally. Not now. Not knowing what I know. Then you'll lose everything, Sarah warned. Is that what you want? Looking at the bracelet one last time, Mark thought about Eliza, about Jasmine, about generations of people who had faced far greater losses for far less choice. Maybe, he replied, losing everything I thought mattered is exactly what needs to happen. The community center donation ceremony was smaller than originally planned. After the board's failed attempt to remove him, thwarted by a combination of public pressure and unexpected shareholder support, Mark had scaled down his public appearances. But this event was different. As he prepared to sign the documents transferring ownership of one of his smaller properties for use as a technology training center, a young man approached the podium. He introduced himself as Marcus Williams, and his words changed everything. My great-great-grandmother was Eliza, he said quietly, pulling out old photographs and documents. We've been tracking your recent actions, Mr. Johnson. The bracelet you found, it was never lost. It was waiting. The room fell silent. Marcus continued, producing more documents, letters, diaries, and most surprisingly, financial records. After emancipation, your great-great-grandfather set up a secret fund, Marcus explained. It was meant to provide reparations to the families who had been enslaved here. But the money was hidden away by subsequent generations of your family. We've been gathering evidence for years, waiting for someone in your family to be ready for the truth. Mark stood frozen, realizing that Jasmine's presence in his house hadn't been coincidence. She stepped forward now, standing beside Marcus. We're distant cousins, she explained. Our families have been connected for generations, though yours didn't know it. The bracelet was passed down through our line, along with the responsibility to remember, to watch, and to wait. Marcus opened a leather portfolio, revealing detailed records of the hidden fund. The original amount, with compound interest, would be worth approximately $150 million today. Your great-grandfather diverted it into various accounts, eventually using it to start the businesses that became your family's legitimate wealth. The revelation hit Mark like a physical blow. His entire transformation had been sparked by historical discovery, but this was immediate, concrete, and actionable. Jasmine spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. We're not here to demand anything, Mr. Johnson. We're here because you've shown that you're ready to do what's right. The bracelet chose this moment, and you proved it chose correctly. Mark looked at the gathered crowd, community members, students, educators, and a few loyal friends who'd stood by him through his transformation. The weight of history and possibility hung in the air. The training center isn't enough, he said finally. We need to make this right. Over the next hour, with lawyers present, Mark began the process of not only acknowledging the hidden fund, but committing to its restoration. The Technology Training Center would be just the beginning. He announced the creation of a comprehensive reparative justice program, managed jointly by community leaders and financial experts. The program would include full scholarships for descendants of the enslaved families, business startup funds for community entrepreneurs, housing assistance programs, healthcare initiatives, continued educational support through the Johnson Legacy Education Initiative. As the documents were being signed, Jasmine stepped forward with the bracelet. It belongs with the community now, she said, in the training center, as a reminder of where we came from and where we're going. Sarah wasn't present for the ceremony. Their relationship hadn't survived his transformation. But as Mark watched Marcus and Jasmine place the bracelet in a display case in the new center's lobby, he felt a different kind of connection forming, one based on truth, justice, and shared purpose. The final document he signed that day wasn't a financial one. It was a public acknowledgement of his family's history, the wrongs committed, and a commitment to ongoing reparative action. Not as charity, not as generosity, but as a long-overdue fulfillment of a historical debt. This isn't the end of the story, Marcus said as they shook hands. It's the beginning of a new one. Kay looked around at the faces in the room. Millionaire receives mysterious gift from his black maid. IS meaning leaves him paralyzed. A simple gift carries a profound message that shakes him to his core. As he uncovers its significance, he confronts truths that he had long ignored. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The rain drummed against the tall windows of Mark Johnson's mansion, creating a stark contrast with the bright lights and animated chatter inside. The annual Technology Sector Gala was in full swing, with Silicon Valley's elite mingling in tailored suits and designer dresses. Mark stood near the grand staircase, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, watching his guests network and laugh at carefully crafted jokes.